Now, lastly, for this lecture, what we'll do is look at some of the statutory rules that will control the entire situation of duty breaches and payments arising from duty breaches. So first of all, just note that Section 536 requires directors to disclose to the board their conflicts of interest in something that they're discussing in board dealings. There are some exceptions for this. Take a look at the wording of 536, and also note that this applies even to a company where there is a single director and a single member. And in that case, it would be noted in the minutes of the meeting, so that later, if the company were to become insolvent, it would be possible to understand what was going on during the meeting. And this applies to shadow directors as well. Now, executive remuneration is a big problem globally, less so in Hong Kong because many directors own their own companies, but this is a problem with a way that directors can take funds out of companies. They can extract funds from companies. In Hong Kong, what we have in the model articles for public companies is that the general meeting sets the remuneration. Of course, the articles can be amended. And what we do have is something very similar to the UK law, that if we have a director's service contract which exceeds 3 years, then it must be given to the members for their approval. They must have access to be able to look at the agreement and then make a decision and vote for its approval. So in executive compensation, executive remuneration is not really a problem in Hong Kong in terms of being excessive, but we do have some fairly strong rules applying to it. We do have a number of rules, Section 500 and following, or actually with the definitions beginning a little bit earlier, on loans from the company to directors. There are many exceptions to this, and ultimately it can be approved by the members. And so I'm not asking you to study this specifically, but you should note that loans from a company to a director is a classic case of conflict of interest, because of course the director would like to receive the loan. And unless the company is a bank, it probably shouldn't be done. We do have an exception for bank. And ultimately, however, the members may approve these loans, and there are a great number of exceptions in this very complex portion of the Hong Kong Companies Ordinance. Now, we've got the problem that the law, on the one hand, tries to keep directors honest by imposing liability on them for breach of duty. What happens if the directors manage to sneak into the Articles of Association by advising the members to vote for it? A provision that simply exempts them from liability. Then the entire structure of the duties of the directors becomes much less powerful. And this sort of exemption is void. If we don't have an outright exemption, we could also simply have an indemnification. And indemnification means essentially, another word that's used for this is holding harmless, but it's essentially where the company itself acts as an insurance provider, that if the director must pay damages to the company will pay that back to the director. And you can see why that would be void as well. However, we do have the possibility of indemnifying an innocent director for the costs of defending themselves in court against an allegation that they are liable to the company. And that is no doubt necessary to help hire good directors, because otherwise they might be afraid of lawsuits against themselves. However, This is somewhat frustrated by the generally accepted practice that is sanctioned by the ordinance that a company may buy liability insurance. It's usually referred to as directors and officers liability insurance for the directors. And then if they were to do something to breach their duties and damage the company, and they were to be found liable to the company, then the insurance policy, which the company pays for, will reimburse or pay for the liability. So the directors still escape the liability, although the company will receive payment, in this case payment from an insurance company. And D&O insurance, directors and officers liability insurance, is generally accepted good practice in Hong Kong, and it is expressly permitted by the law. We should also remember that the company may, by ordinary resolution, ratify director's action. So let's say a director breaches the duty of care, and the members simply vote by majority that this is something that they do not object to. Where directors are relatively powerful and members are working in blocks, this can be a problem because perhaps the minority members would not want to ratify, and the majority members do. And so this ratification is something which can ultimately be reviewed by the court, and the court need not always accept it. But in a duty of care context, there's a very good chance that the members will be able to ratify and exclude, therefore, a director from liability in breach of the duty to the company. So lastly, we have a provision which you'll see referred to and is not really used. It's not a useful provision. Section 903, it seems like it could be useful, but essentially it's something like a reasonable behavior exclusion. So if a person is found guilty of misconduct, that is a breach of the duty of care or fiduciary duty in their role as a director, and this person has acted honestly and reasonably, and in light of all the circumstances ought to be fairly excused of the misconduct, then the court may excuse them under Section 903. But given the relatively good framing of the fiduciary duty, which in most cases allows the director to decide what is in the interest of the company, and therefore can allow the director to escape many cases of misbehavior, and also the duty of care, which is fashioned in a very careful way, looking at the care, skill, and diligence that can be reasonably expected of a reasonably diligent person fulfilling the functions that they should fulfill in that particular company. Given that those two duties are pretty well written as they are, it's going to be extremely difficult, and we don't have cases that do it, but it's going to be extremely difficult to find a director who is both guilty of breaching a duty and therefore found to be reasonable and honest under Section 903. So although this may be tossed in, and if you were defending a director, you'd certainly try to toss it in, because why not? In litigation, it has never in Hong Kong carried the decision of a court. So that was a director's duty of care and fiduciary duty. We will be looking at the cases, and we'll be applying the reasoning of the cases in our application of law problem. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Note that this week you do have an automated quiz, so please complete that before we meet in class.